Hi, I'm Tara Palmeri, your feared and fearless political reporter. Every day, it feels like there's a drip, drip, drip of more reporting on the cover up of Joe Biden's campaign and its final days. On this show, I have an exclusive first look at a book by legendary journalist Christopher Whipple called Uncharted: How Trump Beat Biden, Harris, and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. In this interview and the book, Whipple reveals shocking details about when the typically suave George Clooney lost his cool and cursed out a Morning Joe producer because the host of the show, Mika Brzezinski, said that Clooney was authorized to write that damning op-ed that called on Joe Biden to drop out by President Barack Obama. That article not only was a directive to Joe Biden, it was a directive to the entire Hollywood donor community to stop giving money to Joe Biden. It also offered some cover to some spineless politicians that it was time for them to step up and call on Joe Biden to resign. In this episode, we also get into how Joe Biden's family reacted to that disastrous debate with Donald Trump and how they closed ranks around him in his final days, protecting him. He also reveals a secret, never before reported on meeting between Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden at the White House when she pleaded with him to drop out of the race. And then Whipple reveals what Trump was thinking the entire time. This is a fascinating show. I hope you'll stick around. Chris, thanks so much for joining the show. I've got to say, this is an incredible book. Thank you for giving me a peek. I feel like I understand a lot more about what was happening during these final few weeks between the debate and when Joe Biden finally dropped out of the race.
Great to be with you. Thanks for reading.
So a really big part of this campaign, which is sort of still kind of overlooked, is how impactful George Clooney's op-ed in the New York Times was in terms of giving cover to, spineless politicians to say Joe Biden needs to step out, but also to tell the Hollywood community that they no longer should give money to Joe Biden, that the money was going to dry up. And you have a particularly interesting anecdote in the book about how he reacted when Mika Brzezinski said on Morning Joe that it was former President Barack Obama that gave him, the green light to publish that op-ed, and what followed when he said, "I love you, Joe, but you look like death at that fundraiser I saw you at, and it's time to drop out of the race."
Yeah, the George Clooney story is absolutely fascinating to me. I mean, really, this whole story leading up to that fateful weekend of July 2021, when Biden finally stepped aside, is a Shakespearean drama with all kinds of betrayals and some noble stuff as well. And Clooney is right at the center of it because, he's not just George Clooney. He was a real power in the Democratic Party, and whether you want to call them elites or a cabal or patriots, Clooney had a huge impact with that devastating op-ed that he wrote. And the next day, Mika Brzezinski went on Morning Joe, and there was this extraordinary segment they did where she really went after Clooney and suggested, and again, now I'm just paraphrasing, but suggested that Barack Obama, in effect, put him up to it. And this was, and she also took a couple of real shots at Barack Obama that were really kind of gratuitous at the time, or so it seemed. So the story, though, that I tell in the book is that shortly after this segment aired, someone who shall remain nameless, connected with the Morning Joe program, walked into his apartment. His phone lit up, and it's George Clooney, a good friend of his. And Clooney went absolutely ballistic. And what ensued was an exchange of f-bombs for several minutes. It went on. Clooney hung up, called him back. They continued to argue. This person connected with Morning Joe said, "Look, George, this is not a movie. It's not a movie script. This stuff vanishes. It's over. It's not that important." But Clooney was apoplectic that Mika Brzezinski had suggested on the air, and nobody had challenged her, more important, Um, she suggested that Barack Obama put him up to it.
According to your reporting, Clooney shouted into the phone at this nameless producer who you were protecting, "You effed me. You're my friend. You should have stood up for me." And this producer responds, "George, it's just not a movie where you go script page to script page." George responded, "F you." And the producer responded, "F yourself." You got to give it to the producer. Not a lot of them would probably shout back at an A-list actor like that. Apparently, Clooney hung up, but then called back again. He was so angry. The producer explained, "This is a morning talk show on a cable channel. Nobody gives an F if we say he should get out or if he should stay in. Nobody effing cares. It's skywriting. It's effing gone. George, I told you before, we'll try and take care of it tomorrow morning. I promise you." And Clooney responds, "I don't know whether I trust you." The producer says, "Well, F you. If you don't trust me, stop effing calling me." Doesn't sound like the cool George Clooney that we know.
This really struck a nerve with George Clooney, clearly. And so, look, readers can draw their own conclusions about what that might mean or not mean about Clooney's relationship with Obama. But to me, what's so fascinating about it is that, Clooney has said, I think, in his only real remarks about his op-ed after the fact, he said, look, the only thing that matters is that Joe Biden, and I'm paraphrasing, made this brave decision to step aside. He did the right thing. Well, respectfully, that's not the only thing that matters. What matters for history is how that came about. And George Clooney was clearly a real player in that process.
Did you ever get down to the bottom of whether Obama did, in fact, tell George Clooney to publish that op-ed?
I don't think anybody knows for sure. I asked his chief of staff, his second chief of staff, Bill Daley, what he thought, and Daley said, "I said, do you think he gave Clooney a green light?" And Daley said, "I don't think he would have given him a red light."
Interesting. I also want to talk about what happened after the debate. Okay, so Joe Biden's family always talks about it. It's the most important thing to him. They seem to have really closed ranks around him and tried to create a protective bubble around him. His sister, Valerie Biden Owens, you write in the book that she was completely devastated after this. Tell me more about what happened, how the family reacted to the debate in the hours following it.
12:30 a.m. that evening, one of Joe Biden's best friends picked up his phone and saw that Valerie was on the line. She was distraught. She was in tears and she was furious and she could barely contain herself. She said, "What did they do to my brother at Camp David?" was her opening line. And she, again, couldn't go on much more than that. She was so distraught. She clearly was lashing out and blaming people other than Joe Biden, namely his debate team. And she called back the next morning. Again, called Biden's friend, said, how could they have done this? How could he have arrived just minutes before the debate? How could they not have given him decent makeup? How did he wind up looking like Dorian Gray? And this friend of Joe Biden's didn't really have the answers. All he could do was listen and kind of talk her off the ledge.
What about Jill Biden? I know we all saw her afterwards say, "Honey, you did such a great job. You answered all the questions." I mean, that was the public Jill Biden. And was she like that privately? Were they telling him, stick it out, you can get through this?
Well, every indication we have is that we can't know what their private conversations were like in behind closed doors, but there was certainly that telling moment right after the debate when she was enthusiastically saying he'd done just fine. Look, the family really was behind him to stay in the race. But to me, the really extraordinary thing is the way all of Biden's inner circle came around him and were all in on this decision to run for reelection. Their job is, frankly, that's not their job. Their job, the inner circle, the people like Mike Donilon, Steve Ricchetti, Bruce Reed, and others who were so close to him, is to try to be clear-eyed and realistic. And yet nobody ever sat Joe Biden down and said, "Hey, listen, boss, Are you sure you're up to this? I mean, I know that Bill Daley told me, again, the former Obama chief, he ran into his friend Tom Donilon, brother of Mike, of Joe Biden's alter ego. And Tom Donilon told him, look, not even my brother has had that conversation with Joe Biden. Now, you can be sure that if Mike Donilon didn't have that conversation, it's pretty certain that no one did.
Interesting. There was someone who finally had a conversation with Joe Biden after the debate that hasn't been reported, and you reveal this in your book, that Nancy Pelosi had a secret meeting in the White House, and she made sure not to go into the Oval because she wanted to try to convince Joe Biden to drop out of the race.
It was really a clandestine get together. She wanted to make sure that she wasn't seen meeting with Biden. So they had the meeting in the residence and not in the Oval Office, I'm told. It was very difficult to confirm this. Jeff Zients, Biden's chief of staff, finally and reluctantly confirmed it when I called him on it because I knew he had to know about it. But it was extraordinary because she went and she had a one-on-one in person, just the two of them. She said, we began by talking about America. They love to talk about history. They have a shared Catholic faith. She came away. Biden didn't, in the meeting, Biden didn't give in. He didn't say, okay, I'm getting out. But she knew she'd gotten through to him. And she told friends thereafter that I knew I'd gotten through to him. He trusts me. And so at that point, I think she knew that he ultimately would pull the trigger and step aside.
How many weeks passed between that meeting and when he ultimately pulled out of the race?
It's 10 days later, because this
10
was
days.
July 11th. She went and she met with the president after she was on Morning Joe, when she famously went on and she said, well, I think she said words to the effect of, we're waiting for him to make up his mind. When she brilliantly and casually just sort of put the ball back in his court. Well, it was later that day that she went over to the White House and had this secret meeting with Biden.
Interesting. And so this was actually before Schumer's meeting with Biden, because Schumer also went to Delaware to try to convince him to drop out of the race.
That's right. Schumer went as well. But I really think it was the Pelosi meeting that was the telling one.
What about how the Trump campaign was feeling this entire time? You talked to Paul Manafort, obviously his former campaign manager who went to prison. He's fresh out of prison. And you seem to suggest that he had a very more prominent role in the campaign than what has been depicted in the press.
This, again, is sort of one of the untold stories of that campaign that I found absolutely fascinating, is that Manafort, who disgraced, who'd spent time in prison, was suddenly back in the saddle, campaigning for Trump. And then he publicly said he was stepping aside, but that wasn't the case. He was operating under the radar. You just didn't see him. He was at the convention, and he really shaped that convention. He's an expert at that. I was talking to him regularly throughout the campaign, and it was really fascinating because he was talking to Trump and he was telling me what they thought was going to happen. And I'll never forget, literally the day before that fateful weekend, July 2021, I emailed Manafort and I said, what do you think? Is he in or is he out? And Manafort replied, he's out. He's out this weekend. And I wondered how in the world he could know that. And anyway, it was
he might have an inside source
that he called it.
I think we all felt it was coming. I was on standby at all times. What was Kamala Harris thinking at the time?
Well, Kamala Harris clearly thought that this might happen. And I'm talking about now days in advance of that weekend, July 2021. No one knew for sure, and neither did she. But she was making very private efforts to get ready. They put out the word to Democratic political operatives, people they thought could not be linked to the Harris campaign. That was important. They couldn't be seen to be plotting, but they were getting ready and looking at the rules and making sure that there was a way for her uh, to capture the nomination in the event that Biden stepped aside. So she couldn't have been shocked when she got that phone call on Sunday, the 21st, and she was ready. They were ready to go.
Interesting. Do you think she was aware of the actual day, or she just knew it was coming?
I don't think she knew it was happening that day. But
Okay.
for days in advance, that previous Thursday at least, she had people out, operatives out, looking at the rules, trying to make sure that they would be ready in the event that it happened.
So there are obviously a flood of Biden books coming out right now. I just interviewed another group of journalists earlier this week about their book. And a big word that keeps coming up over and over again is the word cover up. Do you think that this was a cover up of Joe Biden's mental, physical condition and an attempt to keep him in the race, even though everyone around him knew that he was not capable of running for president again or even being president at that time?
I don't think this was a cover up in the classic Watergate sense. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Since Watergate, the notion of a cover up has always been, hiding something that you know to be true. What was amazing about this story is that everybody around Biden, or many of the people around Biden, his inner circle, convinced themselves, really believed that he could run for reelection and win and govern for another 4 years. I think that was delusional, but I think they were operating in a fog of delusion and denial.
Power hungry, perhaps?
Power hungry, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, that's who knows, but the psychology of it is
hungry to
fascinating.
hold on to the power they had.
So of course,
Nobody wants to give it up.
Of course, you may want it. But on the other hand, these are people who historically had stepped up and made tough decisions. In 1988, when after the plagiarism scandal, when Biden was running for president, Ted Kaufman, his best friend, stepped in and said, "Hey, it's time to go, Joe." That never happened in this case. And to me, it's absolutely fascinating. There was this kind of suspension of disbelief. Nobody would have sent Joe Biden onto that stage with Donald Trump in June in an early debate if they hadn't thought somehow that he could pull it off. A lot of them believed it. And I'm talking about Mike Donilon. I'm talking about Jen O'Malley Dillon, who's usually pretty clear-eyed and ruthless. Anita Dunn, they all bought into this notion. As Bill Daley said to me, they were in the bubble. They crossed the Rubicon, and there's no going back.
Yeah, but they also said that he was winning. He could win all of these battleground states. I don't know. It seems a little off to me.
Well, they knew they had a problem on the campaign trail, and that's why they knew he couldn't campaign the way he once had, and that's why they hid him in the basement in 2020. And I have a scene in the book that I think is extraordinary when a veteran Democratic campaign operative is interviewing for a job in the Oval Office with Biden and his closest aides. And they say to her, it takes this incredibly candid turn. They say to her, "You know what? In 2020, we had this excuse of COVID to keep him in the basement. What do we do now?" So,
and what did that person say?
Well,
Do they offer advice?
They certainly knew that Biden was a shadow of himself on the campaign trail. But they will all, most of them will tell you, and I'm talking now about, I spoke to all of his closest advisors. Mike Donilon will tell you to this day that he never saw Joe Biden mentally diminished at any point. He's convincing to me. He really believes that. Now, whether this is delusional or not, that's maybe.
You start to believe your own lie. People do that sometimes.
Sort out.
Yeah. Ron Klain pushed back on your book as well, because, you had reported that he was aware, too, that Biden was not himself and that he might not be able to appear on that debate stage.
What I'll say about that is that the portrait that Ron Klain painted of Joe Biden during the debate prep at Camp David was devastating. This was a president who was wobbly, This was a president who couldn't talk to you about any of his plans for a second term. A guy who wandered off at one point and sank into a lounge chair and fell asleep by the pool. Somebody who couldn't go even half the distance during the debate prep sessions. And yet, and Ron won't deny any of that. I mean, Ron hasn't questioned anything that I've quoted. So I would just say to readers, pick up the book and read Ron's description, his words, not mine. Read Ron Klain's description of that Camp David debate prep and see what they think.
If you like this show, please smash that subscribe button and share this with your friends. I'll be back again this week.